cosmic,
Yeah, yeah.
which means intensely universal. It brings those two things together.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Right? That's a strange conjunction because those two things are actually quite far apart.
Yeah, yeah.
Like the more personal something is in some ways, the less cosmic, the less universal it is.
Yeah.
But the dream unites those.
It kind of unites them, yeah.
Yeah,
There's
yeah.
something.
So I wonder, see, an archetype in some ways bridges the gap between the personal and the cosmic. So, well, here's an example of something you can do with a dream that's very effective.
Yep.
So imagine that you have a client who's chased by something awful in a dream, and that repeats.
Yep.
And then you ask them what they do, and they say, well, I run away or I try to hide.
Yeah.
Okay. So then you say to them, well, here's what we're going to do instead. I want you to sit there, close your eyes, and make them relax so that they get into a state where they can visualize, right?
Right.
Say, now, bring that dream to mind.
Yeah.
Okay, now, close your eyes, bring the dream to mind. Now, tell me what's happened.
Yeah.
So they'll replay the dream and say, now, okay, now, at the end, instead of running, tell me what happens if you turn around and ask the criminal or the
Monster.
sadist or the monster
Yeah.
what it's up to.
Yeah.
Or what happens if you approach it instead of running?
Right.
Well, and then the dream will continue in their imagination most of the time. And generally what occurs in a consequence of that is that dream goes away. Now, I think the reason for that, and I think this is akin to this bridging of the gap between the personal and the cosmic, is because their personal response to being chased is to run
Right.
and hide. So they're prey animals.
Yeah.
Now, if you transform that into voluntary explorers, then what you're doing is you're inculcating an element of the hero myth into the dream landscape. It's like, no, the right strategy when you're threatened isn't to run. The right strategy is to turn voluntarily and to commence the process of exploration. That is what a hero myth is.
That's very interesting. So let's go on that whole thing, right? So the monster in your dream represents your hyperactive amygdala and the limbic centers of the brain being hyperactive, up to 30% more active in the dream landscape, right?
Okay, so that's that overplay of emotion.
That's the overplay of the emotion. And
Yeah.
by the way, the hippocampus also turns out the memory part of the brain is also hyperactive in the dream REM world. So you have the memory spilling into this narrative about a monster chasing you, right? So you give it identity, you give it name, you give it, all these negative features. It's very
Okay, so
clear.
you're contextualizing the emotion.
Contextualize it based on the hyperactive hippocampus.
Yeah.
Then it's chasing you, and you can't run away because we said the central motor generator of your brainstem is making it very hard for you to move. So you don't have so movement normally occurs in the motor cortex of your brain that gives you voluntary movement. But because that part of the brain can't compete with the central motor, automatic part of the brain firing and making your behaviors all, sporadic and automatic, so you can't get away. Now, what you said was interesting. You said if you turn around and approach the monster will become diminished in strength. And that's interesting because we know in the real world, if you simply by walking, you will turn down the activity of the amygdala because you're telling your brain or yourself that you're engaging in approach behavior instead of withdrawal behavior.
Right. Which puts you, see, that shifts your identity in relationship to the thing that's chasing you.
You're changing and saying, now I'm no longer the prey here, I'm the predator, I am the one that is doing the hunting. And so in that sense, it would make sense that the monster would vanish. So that's very interesting. But I also want to touch on on monsters, since we're on the topic of monsters. So this condition called sleep paralysis, and I talk about it in my Peterson Academy course. There's a whole lecture on sleep paralysis. So are you familiar with sleep paralysis?
I experienced sleep paralysis repeatedly.
Is that right?
For years, especially if I slept on my back. That doesn't happen anymore, but I'm very familiar with sleep paralysis.
Can you see any monsters? Can you explain that? I'm curious. So
most of my experience was being unable to move and I knew what sleep paralysis was, so even when it happened to me in my dreams, usually my experience was that I something was happening to me and I was frozen and unable to speak, and I knew I had to wake myself up.
Yeah.
Like I tried to throw myself off the bed.
Yeah.
Sometimes I could yell to my wife. I mean, literally in my life, I would yell and she'd have to come and shake me and then I'd wake up.
Yeah.
But no, I didn't have the monster element to it.
Okay.
But I had clients who did in sleep paralysis. I think the reason that didn't happen is because I knew what was happening.
Yeah.
Right. So the monster too, just out of curiosity, so you can imagine that with this interplay between the hippocampus and the amygdala, if the emotional systems are more active, okay, so now there's lots of emotions being triggered.
Yeah.
Now the memory systems are interacting with those emotions. They're going to flesh them out.
Yeah.
Right. So here's the emotion. Here's the thing that would be most likely to manifest that. So if it's a panoply of emotions, it would be an amalgam of emotion-evoking stimuli, and there's no difference between an amalgam of emotion eliciting stimuli and a monster.
Right.
Those are the same thing.
Same thing.
That's what a monster is.
Yeah.
Right.
So
So a monster is your worst nightmare come to life.
It's your worst nightmare, right? It's whatever you dread, whatever is lurking in your unconscious mind. That's coming to the fore, right? And so during sleep paralysis, so interestingly, you didn't have any of the monsters.
No.
But it turns out about 40% of people will see monsters. Sleep paralysis is a terrifying experience. So you have this REM paralysis, obviously. You're paralyzed from head to toe. During REM sleep, you're dreaming away. Occasionally, for some people, they might start feeling like they can see their surroundings, so they might open their eyes, and then they realize, my God, I'm paralyzed. I can't move. I can't speak. And it's terrifying at this point. And then they look around, and I had one of these experiences. So let me tell you about my own experience. So I was sleeping in my room as a teenager in Copenhagen, and I grew up in a ghetto-like neighborhood in Copenhagen, and I was lying there sleeping, and then I woke up, paralyzed, unable to move or speak, and then I had this creepy feeling of a monster from the corner of my room approaching me, and it came closer and closer until it was on my chest, strangling me, and I saw my legs flying up and down. And mind you, at this point, I was like, is this real? It was as crisp as this conversation you and I are having right now.
What did the monster look like?
Well, I'll tell you.
Okay.
So at this point, I just saw my legs flying up and down, and it was choking me, and I couldn't do anything. I was literally trying to kill me. Now, on this occasion, I didn't see a monster. I didn't see a monster on this occasion, but I've had sleep paralysis since then on many occasions, and I've had various monsters. So I've seen, like, one was Colonel Gaddafi, an eccentric figure. He was hovering over me when I was living in Egypt for a period of time in my early undergraduate years. I was living out there, and I saw during the Libyan Revolution, of all people, Gaddafi was in my bedroom, hovering over me, attacking me. So that can happen during sleep paralysis, and that was.
So he's the monster of the oppressive patriarchy.
Yes, absolutely.
My wife had a dream like that about Richard Nixon, dressed in a general's outfit.
All right.
So he was another figure, like you could think about him as the monstrous form of the patriarchy.
Yeah.
My wife kissed him.
Okay.
Right. So that was how she reconciled that conflict.
Oh yeah.
Very well. You can think about it. It's a funny move, right? Because the monstrous element of the patriarchy it's the negative side of the social order.
Yeah.
It's something everyone has to contend with. That's a class of monster, like giant. It's the same thing as giant. And in hero mythology, of course, one of the categories of monster that the hero fights is giant. There's dragon. Dragon is a different. That's more like a representation of the terrible aspect of nature. That's a good way to think about a dragon. Okay, so you said you were in Libya?
Well, I was in Egypt. Egypt, yeah.
What was happening around you?
Around that time, there was a spring, the Arab Spring and the Libyan Revolution. All that was going on, and I was watching CNN all the time,
You should never do that.
Yes, that I should never do, right? So I was doing that. I was sort of watching the news, and I was influenced in some way. So that's really interesting. So our research now in about 7 countries has shown that whenever you have a cultural narrative for it, like stories of witches, of space aliens or whatever, you will have those lurking into your unconscious, and you will see that manifest, right?
Right.
So
right.
we show.
So those are categories of the monsters.
Those are your Carl Jung archetype, figures appearing. So, for example, in Egypt, we showed that the evil genies of Aladdin, you know Aladdin,
Yeah,
the cartoon,
yeah.
you will have that appear in front of you. So they will have bloody fangs and everything will be creepy, very scary monsters you will see in Egypt. In Italy, for example, in the Pandafrica region of Italy, you will see these giant cats or witches. So that's very common. And in the U.S., space alien abduction
Right.
is very common in the U.S. So you might see that.
Okay, so what that would imply is that you could imagine that the cultural, okay, so let's say the core of the revelation is diffuse emotional activation, much of it negative emotion.
Yeah.
Okay, now the question is, what's the most basic form in which that could take perceptual shape? Okay, so the cultural narrative would be like a first order elaboration of the core of that fear. So then it's not surprising at all that that's what your mind would latch onto when it was trying to clothe that emotion in perceptual reality.
It's very interesting, actually. So it turns out if you go first order on the basic level, most people will just see shapes and shadows. So they won't even see the monster clothed and have all these details. So it turns out,
Right,
all
that's
over
the truly unknowable monster.
That's the V1. That's the you know the occipital lobes and the visual cortex responds to lines and basic shapes. And as we move,
I see. Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
So the first order.
Is it first order? It's simply the brain says, look, I don't even care about the details. I feel fear right now. I just want to hallucinate the basic.
Just the sketch.
The sketch, right? So you have the sketch, and then
Okay, so then as you explore, does it move up the visual?
then it moves up the visual hierarchy, right? So we know then that you have a part of the brain called the MT, the motor part of the brain. It has to do with movement. So that's the next in the hierarchy. Then you have a part of the brain that has to do with, as we said, putting faces, and depth and color. And so that comes as we move along the visual hierarchy. And then finally you reach the Wernicke and the meaning part of the brain, the hippocampus, and you go, my God, this is Freddy Krueger from Elm Street. He's attacking me right now, and he has this agenda and intentions. So, but most of the time, people will see these shadows and shapes, and that's it. And that's it.
Are they most terrified at that level?
It's very terrifying. Usually, the one reason for this is that usually when you don't have an identity, it's even more scary.
Yes,
because you have the
because you don't know what to do.
Exactly.
Yeah. So okay. So then you imagine that. Oh, that's so cool. So then you imagine that adaptation would proceed in this manner. So when it's only shapeless form,
right,
you have no idea what to do because there's no concrete action you can take against a shapeless form.
Yeah.
Okay, so now you can imagine using this in behavior therapy to deal with fears. It's like, okay, first of all, because you're trying to get it to take form.
Yep.
Well, why? Because the more form it takes, the more delineated the strategy can be for dealing with it.
Yeah.
So you're saying, okay, so first of all, you're doing a walk through the visual hierarchy.
Yeah.
You got just the shadows and the basic, and then you get the basic motion. And then what's the next level?
You get depth, for example. You get color, V4 area in the brain with color. So you might add color, but that could be another.
Okay. And then it takes a face.
Yeah. And then it takes
and an identity.
It takes a face, identity, and then you hook up the emotional part of the brain, so it gets emotions.
Okay. The next thing you'd need above that would be a behavioral strategy.
Yeah.
So if this named and faced figure now makes itself manifest, what do you need to do? And so, see, this is partly what you do if you're trying to treat someone for post-traumatic stress disorder is you help them specify very clearly,
right,
so give form to the nature of the fear, but that's not enough. It isn't enough to know your enemy, right? That's better than not knowing your enemy because that's even more terrifying, but you want to lay out a behavioral strategy in relationship to that enemy that either quells the threat. So how do you deal with a criminal, let's say? Or, like the optimal strategy would be to take the enemy and to transform him into an ally, right? That's the highest possible level of adaptation.
Absolutely.
Because who needs an enemy? And partly what you're doing, like in therapy, you can go through someone's history and you can see where they might have had a repeated traumatic experience, like in a relationship. Then you have to find out what is it that's absent in their representation of relationship that's exposing them time and time again to that threat, because it means there's something in their perception and their strategy. It's because imagine that you were selectively blind only for white vans that were approaching you from the...
Trading shouldn't have barriers. When Robinhood started, it was built to make trading more accessible. Now, Robinhood offers more sophisticated trading tools. Experience the future of trading on Robinhood Legend, the all-new desktop platform that harnesses intuitive design to deliver a seamless experience for traders. Free to use with a Robinhood account. The future of trading is fast, powerful, and precise. Experience it now on Robinhood Legend. Sign up today. Investing is risky. Robinhood Financial LLC, member SIPC, is a registered broker-dealer. Other fees may apply.
It's not much of a deficit. But your recurring experience would be once every 2 years, you get run over by a white van, and you have no idea why.
Right.
Okay, so that's the account of the lack of your perception and the repeat experience. Okay, so now you have someone who has a repetitive trauma. You think, well, you've got a hole in your adaptive structure. Okay, now you want to characterize that, so give it form, and you want to append it's a perceptual behavioral strategy to it, and that's what'll make the nightmare go away. And it's really remarkable. My experience clinically was that it took very few repetitions of a repeating dream where you inverted the strategy. The dream would almost, my experience was that if you did that once, the person wouldn't have the recurring dream anymore. Right, and it's because you might say at some very deep level they had conceptualized themselves in that situation as nothing but a prey animal. You do the same thing with exposure therapy with agoraphobia, right? Is you get people to imagine what upsets them and then begin to confront it. Right, so, and the generalization element isn't the specific strategy of confrontation, it's the idea that they could be the one that confronts.
No, it's very interesting. There's 2 points on that I want to go into. That's really very fascinating. So first of all, we've shown that when you have a specific cultural narrative for it and a name for it, right, the more terrifying and salient it becomes. So, for example, if you live in Egypt and you say it's these evil genies, they come at night, they choke you, they strangle you, they kill you, then you will, first of all, have this experience much more frequently. So up to 1/3 of more frequency to the experience. That's the first thing.
If there's a cultural narrative.
If there's a cultural narrative. So we compared Egypt to Denmark, my home country. So we compared these 2 countries, and it turns out when in Denmark, by the way, people say most of the time it's just the brain stress. It's nothing terrifying. Like there's no higher explanation for it, right? So it's just physiology.
Right.
In Egypt, you have the opposite, right? The complete opposite. More frequent, more fearful. So 50% of Danish people will say, I think, for Egyptians will say, I will die from this. This is fatal. So this is Egyptians. Okay, so they have that. They say that paralysis lasts much longer. So they will say that paralysis is intense, it lasts much longer. So it seems like through their cultural beliefs, the experience has becomes much more salient, much more profound and impactful. And we
got elements of psychogenic epidemic to it.
Absolutely, and we said, is this true? Is this actually the case? And we went to Italy and we looked at the Italians with these terrifying explanations of sleep paralysis, and we saw the same pattern. The Italians would also have these long episodes. They would have them frequently, and they would be extremely fearful.
So it's like a contagious maladaptive conceptualization.
Absolutely, right? And so it turns out we have a theory for why that occurs.